Thank you for joining me and Mr. Dakota today, and we're going to go ahead and get started. So we have to talk a little bit about the background before we hand it over to Hart Mountain. So I'm going to talk a little bit about how the United States got involved in World War II. And so if you are watching this with someone else or even maybe a pet, I may ask you guys some questions. And when I ask those questions, I'm going to give a little bit of a pause and you can answer them. Now we can't hear you, but that's okay. So before we start presenting, we're going to do this review, right? So how did the United States enter World War II? I'm giving you a little bit of a hint on the screen here. Hopefully you're having really good discussions at home. So as many of you probably said, the United States did not enter the war until after the Japanese bombed the American fleet in Pearl Harbor, Hawaii on December 7th of 1941 in a surprise attack. And if you are interested in learning more about the attack on Pearl Harbor, just check out our student webinar with Pearl Harbor Aviation Museum that we have on YouTube. And so you see this picture. This picture is the day after the Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor. Now, who's the man in the photograph on the podium? I hope many of you said President Franklin Delano Roosevelt, or FDR, because you are correct. And he is delivering this address to a joint session of Congress. This address was broadcast live on the radio. Remember, no TV or internet, to the American people. And an hour after he finished this speech, Congress declared war on Japan, and then Germany and Italy declared war on the United States just a few days later. And that is how the United States entered World War II. And the Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor changed the lives of many Americans, including Japanese Americans and Japanese immigrants living in the United States. Soon, unfortunately, they would become targets and they were persecuted solely based on their heritage. And we're going to talk a little bit about that today. Just 2 short months after the attack on Pearl Harbor, President Roosevelt signed Executive Order, and you see a little bit of it on your screen, 9066, which allowed the Secretary of War to do, and I've given you the quotes here, prescribed military areas in such extent as he or the appropriate military commander may determine from which any or all persons may be excluded. What the heck does that actually mean, right? Well, Executive Order 9066 meant that people can be excluded or moved out of areas that the government thought were military important, say like a coastline. However, the only group of people that were ever moved out of these restricted areas were Japanese and Japanese Americans. And wartime hysteria, and now we're looking actually at a primary source, so this is a photograph from World War II, and wartime hysteria and a history of racism against those of Asian descent led to what we're talking about today, which is considered one of the darker chapters in World War II history. The incarceration of Japanese was based on fear, not based on disloyalty to the United States. And public opinion turned against Japanese Americans in 1942 when fear caused many reasonable people to believe the charges made against them. This built support for the expulsion of Japanese Americans from the West Coast. So let's stop and take a minute to look at this sign from 1942. So you can see here in big bold letters, all Japanese persons, both alien and non-alien, will be evacuated from the designated area by noon on Tuesday, April 7th of 1942. But if you look closely, can you see when this sign was posted? I know it might be a little hard to see. Yeah, April 1st. So if you think about it, how many days did it give those families advance notice that they were leaving? Yeah, less than a week. And signs like these started to appear. And not only were they not given a lot of notice, the size and number of packages were pretty limited, though, basically to what they could carry as a family, as an individual. And so I want to stop here and do a little bit of an exercise. So not only did Japanese Americans have to sell their business and give up their land, they only, like I said, took what they could carry with them. And so if you remember that poster we just looked at, the size and number of packages is limited to be what can be carried to the individual. And as a Japanese American, you don't really know where you're going. You don't know how long you'll be staying. It could be as long as the war takes, which we don't know how long that could be. It could be years. And so people had to leave their homes and sell off their businesses within weeks and sometimes even days. And so they didn't know what kind of condition, if at all, when they came back, what they would find their things. And so I want to do a little activity. If you could only fit 10 things in your suitcase and you could only carry that suitcase with you, what would you have brought, right? So it has to fit inside a suitcase and you can only carry it yourself. You can't have someone else carry it. What would you have taken with you? And you can always, if you're watching this recorded, pause here and then start to play it after you've done creating your packing list. Maybe you're gonna bring things like clothes, maybe a favorite stuffed animal. What about a journal or a diary? Something to draw, something to write in. Well, as we move on, and I wish that we could hear from you guys what you guys would have brought in your packing. I want to focus on drawing and writing. And so in our museum, we have a collection of World War II yearbooks. And I challenge you after this program to go to that website, WWII-yearbooks.org, and find this yearbook that I'm showing you right here from Artesia, California. And in this yearbook, and you'll have to scroll through because we've actually digitized it, you'll find a page from the Japanese Club. And I want you to go and read the paragraph under the Japanese Club. And if you can, contact us on social media and tell us what you found about this Japanese Club from this 1942 yearbook. And one more yearbook that I want to touch on before I turn it to Heart Mountain is another yearbook we have in our collection from Rower Central High School. So some of these internment camps that we're talking about, they actually had yearbooks themselves. They made yearbooks, and we were lucky enough to be given one that we were digitized. And so you can look through it on our yearbook site, and you'll see many images of not only the students that were in this internment camp high school, but also of their reality, what it looked like. And to tell us more a little bit about that reality and what it looked like, and even learn about one of these students in one of these camps, I'm going to turn it over to Mr. Dakota. So with that, Heart Mountain, give it to you.
All right, hi guys. As Kate said, my name is Dakota Russell, and I am the Executive Director here at Heart Mountain Interpretive Center. So for those of you guys who may not have been out this way, I've pulled up the map right here so that you can see where we are in the United States. And you'll see we are right up in the northwest corner of Wyoming there. If you've ever heard of Yellowstone National Park, we're just about an hour away from that. So we are really, in many ways, out in the middle of nowhere. And that is one of the reasons why the government decided that they were going to set up one of these camps out here. So Kate talked to you guys a little bit about the Japanese Americans having to leave their homes on the West Coast, but they actually were sent by the government to 10 camps that have been constructed out here all across the West, and Heart Mountain was one of them. Nowadays, we have the Heart Mountain Interpretive Center, a museum that's located here where the former camp was. So this camp was a big thing at the time. In fact, it held almost 11,000 people. That was big enough to make it the third largest city in Wyoming at the time. If it was still here today, it'd actually be the 10th largest city in Wyoming. And so I want to talk a little bit about what life was like for students here. And I want to talk about one person in particular, Stanley Hyami. And Stanley was pretty typical of the kids that were here at Heart Mountain. He was 16 years old when his family had to leave their home. They ran a plant nursery outside of Los Angeles. And they had to sell all of that and everything that they had and move out here to Wyoming. And so it was really a pretty shocking experience for Stanley. And we're going to show you a little clip that tells some about his experience from a film called Flicker and Eternity.
When our family got to Heart Mountain, all we could see for miles were those tar-papered shacks surrounded by barbed wire and guard towers. It was a scary time for all of us.
Many people have written about the evacuation and have debates about it in heated discussions. First of all, do I think it was constitutional? No, I do not. We did not go through the due processes of law. They didn't have any evidence. Do I think racial prejudice was involved? Yes, I do. The whole mess was unnecessary and a whole lot of trouble could have been avoided. I personally will try to become a greater man for having gone through such experiences, keep my faith in America, and look forward to the future. Lately, I've heard some people outside even want to take our citizenship away. Maybe I'll just have to sneak off to some island and start my own country.
We had come a long way from our home in San Gabriel, just east of Los Angeles. Ma and Pa ran a small nursery, and all of us kids would help out. I was Stan's only sister, Sach. Besides me, there was our eldest brother, Frank, and our youngest brother, Walt. Stan and I were close, especially when it came to talking about books. Back home, we lived in a comfortable house with 4 bedrooms. But in camp, all 6 of us had to live in one cramped little room.
Doggone it, our room is so noisy that I can't study. Oh, well, I should crab. I'll have to devise a means so I can concentrate better.
I hated camp, and I wanted to leave for college as soon as I could. But my little brother Stan was still in high school, so he had to make the best of things. It was hard for him, but he kept busy by drawing and working on the yearbook.
Gee, but the kids at this school are smart. Can't hardly compete against them. Back home, I always got all A's. Hope I got a better grade than yesterday. Got my algebra paper back today. I did even worse. Oh, I had a chemistry test today, and did I bungle it. Darn it, I got my first F on a test today. First one I ever got. I think if I work hard, I might still be able to get all A's.
So you guys can see from that even though kids were taken away from their homes, even though they were stuck in these camps that they could not leave behind barbed wire fences, they still had to go to school, right? And so as Kate showed you earlier, many of these places had high schools and had high school yearbooks. So can we move on to the next slide there? One more. Perfect. And so I actually brought with us here a copy of the 1944 Heart Mountain Yearbook, the Tempo. And Stanley, as you saw in the movie clip there, he was actually worked on the yearbook as the art editor there. And so you can see his picture kind of down there on the third row in the center there. Thank you. But he was an aspiring artist. It was what he really wanted to do, and he goes back and forth a lot of times in his diary about whether he wants to be an artist or do something more practical, like becoming an architect. But ultimately, he decides he's going to be an artist. And so he works on the yearbook here, tries to go to high school. He worries a lot about his grades, though. For all of the kids that were going through this, you can imagine how hard it was to try and keep track of your studies and your math and your history and your chemistry while all of this is going on around you. But they do find ways to express themselves here. And art for Stanley was a big way to sort of work on some of the emotions that he was feeling as he was stuck here. Thank you. So up at the top, you'll see a portrait of Stan from the yearbook, and these actually come from our cartoons from the pages inside of the yearbook here that Stanley has drawn, and they depict some of the things that you would see around camp there. The first one that you see down below the portrait of Stan right there is somebody bundled up and wandering around camp. So the camp was extremely intensely cold, and it got cold almost immediately. Most Japanese Americans started arriving here in September of 1942, and by October of 1942 it was snowing, and by January of 1943 the temperature was regularly in the negative degrees. In fact, the coldest it ever got in that first winter was negative 28, so 28 degrees below zero. And these buildings that you saw, these barracks that they lived in, were not very well insulated. Of course, nobody at first had heavy coats or heavy blankets that they had brought with them. They had all come from the West Coast. A lot of people who came to Hard Mountain came from Southern California, where it never really gets cold. And so people weren't really prepared for this winters, but eventually some coats started to arrive in, the government sent some in, or people would order them through mail order catalogs, and you would see people bundled up and wandering around the streets of Hart Mountain in the wind and the snow. And that's what's depicted in this first cartoon. The second cartoon, you can see, if we go back, you can see Stan sleeping in his bed, right? And behind him, you'll see the only source of heat that they had, which are these coal-burning stoves that each of the rooms that they lived in have. But you can see in his dream, he is leaving Hart Mountain there. He's nicely dressed, got on a nice suit there, and he is getting away from camp. So this shows us somebody dreaming about when they're finally able to leave. And then the last one, you see one of the movie theaters in camp. So they actually had turned sort of smaller buildings that they had set up into movie theaters there, but they weren't really designed for that, and they just sort of had hard wooden benches, and they would project the movie up into the front of this, but you could see in the back that he's questioning whether he's even seeing the movie at this point, because he's stuck behind so many people. Let's move on from there. So another thing that Stan did while he was in camp, and one of the reasons why we know his story so well, is that he kept a diary for the entire time that he was here. And so we learn a little bit about him throughout the diaries that not only have his thoughts that are going on at the time, but also have some drawings in it. You guys probably saw in the film there, the picture that we've got of his house in 1931 to 1942, and then his house 1942 to 1943. And his house that you'll see there is just a room inside of the barracks that the whole family has to live in. He had a B unit right there, so this would have been 20 feet wide by 24 feet long, and the entire family had to live inside of it there. And so they were very cramped quarters, and it was very tough on kids because they couldn't get any privacy, you know, teenagers especially, and they were cooped up with their families. And a lot of times they would try and spend as little time as possible inside of their barrack as they could. But Stan, being a studious guy, liked to keep track of just about everything. And so he was almost always constantly writing, even when he was stuck inside of his barrack there, and it was noisy and he could barely study. He was keeping up with his schoolwork, and he was keeping notes in his diary. And his diary is really special to us because it tells us what's going on in the mind of a young person in the camp. Even though some of these people who were kids in the camp are still alive and can still tell us what it was like, you know, their memories over the years, they reflect on camp differently than they may have felt right immediately at the time. So it's important to us to have primary sources like this diary here. And we are going to link to it so you guys can explore it a little further. And we're also going to take tomorrow to follow up with Stan's story a little later on, because he is going to turn 18 in the camp, and he is going to face a very difficult dilemma on deciding whether or not he is going to go and serve in the Army during the war. So we'll follow up with a little bit on that tomorrow. But for now, I think we can take some questions here. So Kate, I'm only seeing pieces of these chats right here. So if you want to read a couple aloud to me, I'll be glad to field some.
Yeah, I've got a bunch. I actually have one from Leah, and she wants to know, did Japanese Americans ever resist going to these camps, either peacefully or non-peacefully?
Yeah, so the time that all of this was happening, most people just went along with it. Most Japanese Americans considered that this was their patriotic duty, that everybody had to make sacrifices for the war, and this was their sacrifice. And so a lot of people did not question it at the time. However, there were also some Japanese Americans who said, no, this is wrong. And almost immediately, especially people that had a legal background, started to challenge this in the courts. And so they believed the courts would eventually rule in their favor. So the whole time that this was going on, there were cases working all the way up to the Supreme Court where Japanese Americans were trying to fight back against being put in these camps.
Interesting, very interesting. And you can find a little bit more about that on our website. I know that it talks about it, but we have some more questions coming in. So going back to the high schoolers, so did high schoolers like Stanley at Heart Mountain have activities like prom, sports, clubs, things like that?
Yeah, they did. So one thing that was interesting about teenagers at this time is because they didn't like hanging out in these cramped rooms with their families, and because they didn't cook inside the barracks or anything like that. So there wasn't anything like family dinners. They had these mess halls on their block that they'd go to where, you know, there'd be about 250 people. It was kind of like eating in the school cafeteria 3 times a day, but with everybody there. So they didn't have to necessarily come home for dinner. So one of the things early on was there was a real problem with teenagers grouping together in gangs and causing trouble around the camps and kind of running wild. And so the parents all got together and decided we need to create some activities. We need to create a bunch of clubs for the kids to get involved in. And so there were sports clubs, there were weightlifting clubs. Stanley was in a weightlifting club. There were music clubs. Frank and Walt, Stanley's brothers, both played in the Heart Mountain Big Band, the Georgia Gawa Orchestra that played jazz music in the camps. And there were all sorts of things to do. And they did, in fact, have dances here that the orchestra would play for within the camp. And at first they were stuck going to school inside of the barracks. So basically these barracks buildings that they were living in that you saw in the picture just got converted into classrooms. But those didn't work really well. Eventually, after about a year here, they were able to build a nicer high school that had a nice auditorium that they could do dances and stuff in.
And kind of a follow-up question to that, we had Aaron wanted to know, so were the camp schools provided by the government, or were those also put together by the parents of the students?
So it was a little bit of both. So the government knew that they were going to have to set up schooling and that they were going to have to provide some kind of education for these kids in here. And remember, this did disproportionately affect kids. About 60% of the people in camps were kids, were under age 18. And so they knew that they would have to set up something, but they had to do it very, very quickly. Heart Mountain was built over a matter of like 2 months. And so the schools were really, really rough at first, and the Japanese American teachers who were there wanted to get involved and to help out. And so they sort of helped create things, but the state of Wyoming actually would not let them get their teaching certificates in Wyoming, wouldn't let any Japanese Americans do it. So initially they had to bring in white teachers in order to teach, and then the Japanese Americans could only be teaching aides. But they did do a lot, especially those with a background in education, to help set up the schools.
And Jane actually wants to know, does your foundation have any more events? She wants you to talk a little bit more about, because you guys are also closed, are you guys doing anything else live or on social media that people can learn more?
Yeah, absolutely. So we are on here pretty much every day talking about different aspects of the camp. If you go to heartmountain.org, you will see right up front and center the link to our online programming. We'll probably include it in the comments down here too. And you can visit that and see all of the online programs that we set up, including stuff from our artifact collections, programs. You know, we have our chair doing readings from her book as well. And so some very fun stuff that's happening on there.
We actually just had a question, and we will be sharing out all of those links today and tomorrow. Because remember, this is a part 1 of a part 2 series. And someone from Facebook wants to know, does Heart Mountain actually have a relationship with Stanley's family today?
Yeah, so Stanley's family is very active still. You know, it was a big and very close-knit family, and so they remain very active. The diary that I showed is actually at the Japanese American National Museum in Los Angeles, who we work really closely with, and so we utilize a lot of that. And Stanley's story, we'll be sending out some more links to where you can follow up on that a little more too, and see some of the books and movies that have been based on his diary.
Awesome. And then, so we have time for about 2 more questions. So Jackie and Ron both want to know, was Heart Mountain open for the entirety of the war when it started to when it ended, or did it close early?
No, and in fact, it runs all the way. The first people start arriving in August of 1942, and the camp is actually in existence up until November of 1945. So those court cases I was talking about eventually came up to the Supreme Court, and there were 2 that happened: Korematsu versus the United States and Indo versus the United States. And in Korematsu, which is widely regarded as a bad decision by the Supreme Court, they decided that it was constitutional to keep the Japanese Americans in these camps. But in Indo, which happened at the same time, they decided that they could not keep them there indefinitely. And so in the beginning of 1945, the Army announced that the Japanese Americans could go back home to the West Coast. The problem was most people had nothing to go back to at that point. They had lost everything in the process of being removed. And so the camp actually stayed open for so much longer just because people didn't know what they were going to do when they got back.
And that leads us into our last question, which we're going to kind of answer, but we also want you guys to come back tomorrow. And so we have had multiple people asking us, were Japanese Americans ever serving in World War II? Was there pressure to serve in World War II? And so I'll let you answer that a little bit, but we are going to focus on that tomorrow. And so if you join us tomorrow, same time, same place, that is what is going to be about tomorrow's presentation in the second half of Stanley's story.
Yep. And just to give a little teaser, eventually they are allowed to serve. There had been some serving, of course, before World War II. Some of them after Pearl Harbor were discharged with no reason. But some of them continued to serve. Out in Hawaii, you had the 100th Battalion that was created out there that was all Japanese American. And then there was a lot of Japanese Americans who were rejected as well, who tried to enlist after Pearl Harbor and were not allowed to because of their race. And so there was a lot of lobbying going on to allow those folks to get in and allow Japanese Americans to volunteer. And again, we'll get to that tomorrow.
Awesome. And with that, again, Thank you for joining us, Mr. Dakota, from all the way from Wyoming, a little bit colder than Louisiana. But we want to remind you this program is recorded. If you would like to share it out with students or other teachers, it will be on our YouTube tomorrow, actually later today, but then tomorrow we are going to do part 2. So we hope that you join us. You guys had some awesome questions, and we're going to learn more about Stanley tomorrow. So see you tomorrow.
See you guys tomorrow.